Okay, welcome to the first Science of Logic pre-course presentation. One of the reasons why I'm doing these pre-course presentations is because Science of Logic is an extremely difficult text. And as a consequence, I think it is important to have a lot of background information about the person who wrote it, the intellectual environment in which it emerged, some of the conceptual conflicts which were important in mediating its emergence. Throughout the Science of Logic, Hegel makes many references to other philosophers, many of his contemporaries, certainly a number of ancient philosophers. And so I think this background is going to just open up a shared foundation and background through which we are going to have a much easier time making sense of some of the more nuanced conceptual arguments and overall logic of this work. And in that vein, this is also a pre-course which is leading into an actual full course on the Science of Logic. Here, finding the key to modern logic. And I think that this is a good way to frame it, finding the key to modern logic, because a lot of what opens up in philosophy, as I've taught many times before, comes from a Hegelian foundation. When we think about Marxism, when we think about the tension between Marxism and capitalism, when we think about the nature of capitalism, also, when we think about the modern scientific universe, an evolutionary universe, a quantum universe, I think that we will find throughout the course of reading the Science of Logic that it's essential to have at least a basic understanding of what Hegel's saying to really make sense of the existence of the modern world. And I think that a lot of conceptual problems and meta-paradigmatic issues, here referring to things like the tension between modernism and postmodernism, here referring to tensions between science and religion, political economy, stem from a general poverty when it comes to the large-scale teaching of what Hegel's talking about in the Science of Logic. So that course starts January 16th, 2023, and there are 4 tiers available: the recorded, the live, an expert session where there will be other people joining me in teaching this book, and also one-on-one options. So this pre-course session is the first. We're going to be focused on formative moments, that is Hegel's thought in between 1801 and 1807. And there'll be 4 other pre-course sessions focused on the phenomenology of spirit, Kant's critique, Fichte's freedom, Hegel's logical response to both Kant and Fichte, and then finally Hegel's logic, its development and its interpretation, which I think will be a great way to jump straight into the Science of Logic itself. So starting with formative moments, basically saying here Hegel's thought, the way it was coming into formation in between 1801 and 1807. I always think it's interesting to take into consideration the age of the philosophers in which they're thinking these works and creating these works. When we're thinking about his formative moments, we're thinking about Hegel in between the ages of 31 and 38. This is when he's, as it were, coming into his own, starting to develop his own foundations, and we'll see starting to offer differentiations as it relates to the history of philosophy. When it comes to actually releasing the Science of Logic, we're looking at Hegel in between the years of 43 and 47, as in his middle age, and he never really leaves the Science of Logic. He continues revising it, he continues updating it all the way up until his death in 1831. And I think for that reason, the Science of Logic holds a special place in Hegel's overall work. Perhaps also because, as we'll find out in the next pre-course lecture on the phenomenology of spirit, Hegel's entire attempt to write the phenomenology of spirit was as a type of precursor to the science of logic. The science of logic is really what he's aiming at. It's where you're getting his own point of view in philosophy, and where he really starts to make a name for himself as it relates to the large conceptual systems of previous philosophers like a Kant, like a Spinoza, like a Wolff, like a Plato or an Aristotle even. So starting here with his thought in 1801 and 1802, Hegel makes an immediate differentiation between a type of systematic logic, what he calls a systematic logic of finite forms, which is generated by the understanding. Now, I've given here two examples, which are very contemporary, but I think they very much apply, just to give you a sense of not only the applicability of Hegel's thought, early thought here to thinking about the modern scientific universe, but also sort of showing the way in which our understanding structures its relationship to the universe at large. When we think about, let's first break down systematic logic, we're talking about systems of concepts. So you can think here of the standard model of elementary particles. You can think here about the different ways in which we can understand the history of biological life forms. And all of these forms, whether they are in particle physics, whether they're in evolutionary biology, whether you come up with a different system of ideas, they're all basically a systematization of finitude. And that concept will become something which Hegel very much seeks to bring out and further develop in the science of logic, the very concept of finitude. And I think that that's really an interesting thing to think, is that science can operate and conceptualize all of these finite forms without necessarily thinking about what is the concept of finitude, right? Like we all have a sort of basic sort of intuitive understanding. Let's hold on to that as well, intuitive understanding. But do we understand the concept of finitude? And do we understand its consequences for the way we systematize our logic? And he then makes a distinction between, and this is a distinction which becomes absolutely central throughout Hegel's career, is the differentiation between the understanding and reason. And for Hegel, it's important that reason not align itself with a systematic logic of finite forms. Not that there isn't a certain necessity to that activity, but just that reason does not align itself absolutely with this logic, but rather directs itself towards forms of human interest, namely questions about how to live. This is in some sense a distinction between the ought and the is, which is another distinction first proposed by David Hume, which Hegel will, it's another distinction to keep in mind, because Hegel will continue to develop this distinction between the ought and the is. And I think that he does an actually brilliant and revolutionary job of dialecticizing the relationship between the ought and the is, which I haven't read before in the science of logic. So it's worth keeping that distinction in mind. But here, just to give examples of that are very modern, is the difference between, okay, we have a understanding of the various particles, but that doesn't really tell us anything about, let's say, the rational consequences for human life of, for example, atomic manufacturing. That when we have an understanding of evolutionary biology, that doesn't tell us anything about reason directed towards human interest as it relates to, say, for example, genetic engineering. And so this distinction between the understanding, our capacity to categorize finite forms, and the consequences of this categorization for our continued sort of exploration and you could even say penetration of nature, the natural world, is really not sort of addressed. And this comes up, and this is sort of another reason why philosophy in general is so relevant for contemporary science, because it asks those questions about ultimately ethical questions about what we're doing in this sort of systematization of nature, mathematization of nature, and our interventions into it, ultimately our increasing capacity to transform it. And what are the consequences of that for human interest, for how we live? What does it mean that we can, for example, manufacture things on the scale of the basic nature of reality? What does it mean that we can retool or re-engineer our entire genetic structure? You know, all of that is coming here into the realm of not just science, but of immanent philosophical interpretation. So let's move on to 1802 and 1803. In 1802 and 1803, carrying on here from his thought previously, asking questions about how to live, Hegel focuses on this tension between the intuition and the concept. And this distinction is one that he inherits from his contemporary German idealists, Kant, Schelling in particular, think about this tension. And as it relates to Hegel's thinking through this tension, he's really on the side, and this is where he starts to differentiate himself from both Kant and Schelling, is that he's really on the side of the concept. He's on the side of this tension being mediated towards conceptual reflection and away from intuitive immediacy, not to get rid of intuitive immediacy altogether, but the need to mature our conceptual reflections about immediacy, which the word he'll use for that in the science of logic is mediation. And immediacy and mediation will never be separated. Just to sort of give a basic sort of understanding of what is the relationship between the intuition and the concept here in Hegel's thought, is in the intuition, we can have visions of immediacy of, let's say, reality as a whole. And I think we've all, I can speak from my own experience, we've had visions of, wouldn't it be nice if reality was a whole, in the sense of we're all together, in the sense that the world is all one, that we are all connected, you know. And I think that type of imagery, that type of intuition is something that structures a lot of utopian political visions, structures a lot of our spontaneous humanist sympathies, for example. However, Hegel's emphasis on conceptual reflection of intuition points us towards a, you might say on first glance, a more disturbing picture of the whole, because it forces us to think about immanent complex paradoxes of the whole, the way in which the whole is not just a smooth oneness or a frictionless oneness, but rather is riddled by contradiction, riddled by antagonism is in another way to say it. And that even is the reason why conceptual reflection is so important and imminently necessary, especially for Hegel's philosophy. So on the one hand, we have this feeling of oneness, this intuition of a deep unity. And on the other hand, we have the necessity of ethical life and the development of laws that require conceptual reflection. And this duality, let's say, between the oneness and the necessity of ethical laws and reflection can be seen on the one hand as an expression of a mystical experience of freedom, you know, this sort of inner self-revelation of the free spirit, of the absolute spirit. But on the other hand, there's always this need to mediate. Again, this concept of mediation is so important for Hegel, of this experience of freedom in actual social life, in actual norms recognized absolutely by spirit, by other spirits. And that this is a process that is imminently historical. It involves real, concrete, you know, living human beings and our social life and the way we organize our society. And of course, thinking through all of these ethical norms and practical realities is extraordinarily complex, confronts you with extraordinary paradoxes. And so this relationship here is another one which calls forth the philosopher. And I think I want to emphasize here that all of these sort of, determinations on Hegel's thought path are ultimately Hegel pointing towards the necessity to call out and bring out the philosopher, and the reason why the philosopher is itself necessary. So next, in 1803 and 1804, Hegel points out that consciousness is nature's height as spirit. And here, this relationship between nature and spirit is another one to pay close attention to throughout the reading of the Science of Logic. But it's also the expression of the height in language and peoples. So it's not just a individualistic notion of spirit. It's not, for example, Descartes' cogito. It is an expression of absolute spirit in a language and a peoples. And we're going to go immediately into where the paradox of the individual comes in. But just this emphasis that Hegel is not thinking in a purely individualistic paradigm. He is thinking about the horizon of historical development and all the language and peoples that are constituting this natural height. Now, the paradox is immediately that when you include conceptual reflection, as Hegel does, and Hegel emphasizes the importance of conceptual reflection, immediately we get here a mechanism within language and within peoples for a process of differentiation. And so Hegel here points towards world spirit as something which naturally differentiates itself in reflection. And this is also another reason why Hegel places so much emphasis on this tension pointing towards deeper conceptual reflection over intuitive immediacy. Because intuitive immediacy imagines a oneness, or has a notion of a oneness, which is self-similar. And this is, again, I think true throughout phenomenology of spirit and throughout the science of logic, is one of Hegel's main concerns, is this absolute notion of pure self-similarity without historical differentiation. He really sees this as holding back our thought and really preventing us from going deeper into notional mediation, ultimately. So there you have the paradox, which is, okay, so consciousness is nature's height as spirit in a language or a people's. But if we're emphasizing this conceptual differentiation, well, how do we deal with this differentiation? Well, Hegel kind of deals with it, I think, in the logic of the negation, where the paradox is that we are unified and stable in this differentiation itself. And so whether it is, and I think this has a lot of relevance for contemporary politics, because whether we're thinking about differentiation in terms of actual thought, which is of course extraordinarily important, we have to conceive of ourselves as stable even in this difference of thought. But also the tension with, for example, contemporary, let's say, woke phenomena, where there is this emphasis on diversity and inclusion. We also have to think of ourselves as stable in this differentiation as well. So we have to think about it in terms of differentiation of peoples, different languages, different ethnicities, different cultural backgrounds. We also have to think of ourselves as stable in the differentiation of thought, of course. And so we have to, I mean, that, and that's another thing, is like what that immediately calls upon us as philosophers, which is, again, another reason why Hegel's calling forth philosophers, is that this moment is calling for such capacity to think this level of difference, right? And it is even perhaps the case that the larger scale meta-paradigmatic tensions in our current culture are in fact a symptom of the need for these philosophers to come forth and be able to think this. Okay, next, moving on to 1805 and 1807. Hegel emphasizes that spirit only achieves self-certainty in a social unity, which opens up differentiation. So again, there's this paradox between unity and differentiation. And that requires a certain social constitution for differentiation. So a social constitution which is shared and which shares basically the social substance, again, the language and the peoples, which has organized itself towards a free differentiation. And this reflects, of course, Hegel's time, Hegel's place in Europe, the replacement of monarchical institutions with democratic republics, the attempt to make this mediation. And I think one of the reasons why Hegel's so important for our time today is because we are going through a crisis of what emerged in his time as it relates to democratic republics. And another reason why we need to call philosophers forth, because we need to think what are the limits of democratic republics? Why are democratic republics under such tension and threat today? And what political social forms do we need to open up some new possibilities for freedom, open up some new possibilities for ultimately conceptual differentiation and new self-reflection? For Hegel, this is all pointing towards a shared space, which is where differentiations can particularly occur in art, religion, and science. And so if art, if religion, if science does not have this shared constitutional space, then that will also fall, in the sense of we will have religious conflict, artistic degradation. Science will not have its sort of social space to carry out its work. And so part of thinking this new type of social constitution for today is to think about the true diversity of art, of religion, of possibly even science in terms of the shared space. I mean, tensions with science come up with, for example, what's the difference between, let's say, Western science and indigenous knowing or Eastern knowing, or so forth and so on. With religions, of course, we have major conflicts with, for example, the different Western traditions, the different monotheistic traditions, atheistic, non-belief, and so forth. So there's a whole new complex paradoxical space, which again calls forth philosophers. So finally, Hegel emphasizes that logic is the science of the concept. So where we have science of physics, where we have science of chemistry, biology, anthropology, these are all for Hegel external reflections of the understanding. But we need to also bring logic into the picture. We need to reformulate logic for the modern scientific universe. He points towards the need to reformulate it from the foundations inherited from Aristotle. And in the logic of this as the science of the concept, what we're really focused on here is conceptual determination by reflective spiritual work. And this differentiates Hegel certainly from Kant, where Kant's logic functions on transcendental a priori categories, that is, categories which are in some sense given. Hegel emphasized that Kant does not derive these categories. He does not tell us how these categories were derived. And also Hegel emphasizes that Kant does not develop these categories. And so does not really develop for Hegel a science of logic, where for Hegel, a science of logic would involve thinking categories derived from experience. Why? Because the categories are the consequence of reflective spiritual work. And so the study of the science of logic is bringing us towards understanding not just the determinism of Newton, but conceptual determination as such. And I think that this is really crucial for thinking the relationship between modern science and philosophy as it relates to even quantum physics. Because, of course, quantum physics also disrupts the notion of a Newtonian determinacy. And Hegel here is working throughout the science of logic with the concepts of determinacy and indeterminacy. He's deriving determinacy from a process which is originally indeterminate, or fuzzy, or paradoxical even in terms of its identity. Okay, so you already see here in 1807, by the time we get to 1807, that Hegel is focused on a science of logic. And the science of logic doesn't exist yet, but the ideas, the seeds of those ideas and the necessity of it are clear in his mind. All right, so what we covered here in Hegel's formative moments in between 1801 and 1807 is a movement from systematic understanding, like the model of particle physics or evolutionary biology, to reason for living, reason for life, keeping reason open instead of fixed in categories of the understanding to life. And these are all calling forth the philosopher again. We have the tension between the intuitive unity and conceptual reflection for ethical life. Now, intuitive unity will hold a high moral standard for itself. It will want, for example, the same thing that conceptual reflection wants. But Hegel's emphasizing that you need conceptual reflection to think the complexities, the paradoxes, the tension, the contradictions. And the intuitive unity in its immediacy cannot do that. Third, consciousness as the height of nature as spirit for stability and differentiation. Again, this paradox of how do we remain stable given this continual self-differentiation? And Hegel's negation of the negation is that we are stable in differentiation itself. And ultimately, as it relates to the science of logic, that's because, you know, we're here pointing towards understanding becoming as such. But that's too far afield in this pre-course lecture. Finally, a social unity which opens up concept determination in art, religion, and science. And here, Hegel is totally open in terms of categorical determination, what the art, what the religion, what the science looks like. And I would even say, as far as, you know, taking this derivation of categories to an extreme, we might even want to say, how can we even understand the derivation of art, religion, and science as such? You know, that's an open question. Just at the bottom there, I just want to emphasize that what all of these things point towards is the responsibility of the philosopher. The philosopher is responsible to keep his or her reason for the living, to open up reflection for ethical life, to mediate stable differentiations, and to engage in artistic, religious, or scientific conceptual determination. And so these are really important things to keep in mind if one is indeed reflecting on their own being for calling out the inner philosopher in their own self. I think these are good things to meditate on. All right, so again, we've gone through the formative moments. Hegel, this is Hegel's thought in between the ages of 31 and 38. We can see Hegel emerging. This is Hegel's thoughts before publishing the Phenomenology of Spirit, before publishing the Science of Logic. But I think it's really important to get this background, this background information so that we can further understand sort of what distinctions Hegel's working with, where his mind is going, and why he was able to stumble upon these ideas about the necessity of a science of logic. And in the next pre-course, we'll cover Phenomenology of Spirit, which was, of course, published in 1807, and look forward to seeing most of you or all of you there for that second session. But before ending, just want to let you guys all know that this is all pointing towards the Science of Logic course. Starts January 16th. And again, there are 4 tiers available for that. So thanks for listening, and we can open it up. Just raise your hand if you do want to ask a question or jump in. Jason?
Hey, could you explain once again the difference between reason and understanding, and do they map onto the is-ought dichotomy? I was a bit unclear. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting what Hegel does with the is-ought dichotomy in the Science of Logic, and again, that's probably jumping too far ahead of this presentation specifically. But as it relates to the reason and the understanding, we'll know from, for example, the Phenomenology of Spirit that Hegel sees. So we have in Phenomenology of Spirit in the chapter on consciousness, we have sense, certainty, perception, and understanding. And only when we get to self-consciousness do we really start to understand the nature of reason. So there is already this distinction. And again, that's also why Hegel wanted to write the phenomenology of spirit before releasing the logic, was to sort of help people understand the becoming of their own consciousness first. But the understanding, Hegel has a really weird relationship to the understanding in the sense that he is in some sense its enemy on the level of, for example, the simple identifications of the understanding. What he's concerned about with the understanding is the way it fixes its forms and the way in which it kind of presents itself as an absolute. Like, for example, like let's take the standard model of particle physics. Like, if you're just identifying in your understanding with that model, you're never going to discover anything new. The actual particle physicists who are doing actual work, they're not they already understand that model. What they're trying to do is operate in the gaps of that model. Like, they're spending all their time trying to find the particles that aren't in the model, right? So when the Higgs boson becomes a part of the understanding, for example, as it did last decade, all of a sudden, the attention, the consciousness of the particle physics community shifts from the Higgs boson to what doesn't exist, or to what is not yet in the understanding, to put it probably more precisely. So rationality is, for Hegel, something which actually disturbs the fixity of the understanding. Now, the understanding, again, Hegel has a weird relationship to the understanding because he also says in the preface of the Phenomenology of Spirit that the understanding is the most powerful force. But it's not the understanding, in the fixed forms of its immediacy. It's almost the power of the understanding in the very emergence of those fixed forms. Like, that's very powerful. Because we stabilize our entire paradigms for thinking in that understanding, right? But he's just saying here, I think on the highest level, we could say that there's a dialectical relationship between the understanding and reason, and it's important to keep that in mind in our own lives and our own understandings. So, Dimitri?
Yeah, I have a question connected to that, because in the philosophy of right, Hegel says that, philosophy paints its gray on gray, and only when the owl of Minerva, it only flies at dusk. So in some sense, the moment you write things down and can conceptualize them in a true form, it has already passed. It's already been written in some kind of sense. It's already been taken up into history. So how does this connect to Hegel's reason informing spiritual work? Because that seems to be very prescriptive, not merely descriptive. While describing philosophy as painting gray on gray is descriptive thing.
Well, I think there's a weird way in which, and this becomes clear in the science of logic, there's a weird way in which sort of the pure indeterminate being, which is also nothing and so forth, on the level of absolute knowing, you are in a type of abstract indeterminacy. It's almost like you're back at the beginning. Like, for example, when I'm listening to you, like when you're forming your questions, speaking towards me, my state of mind, I try to keep my state of mind in an indeterminate space, meaning I'm not filtering your words through my understanding. I'm trying to listen to your words. My mind is indeterminate, and then my job as a philosopher is to try to rationally respond to you in your living immediacy, in serving you, like if I am only responding to you through my preconceptual understanding, then I can't possibly get to the singularity of Dimitri speaking to me right now. It's actually irrational to do that. The only thing that's rational is to keep my mind open and then direct my reason towards the immediacy of that of that question. So I think it's the duty of the philosopher to do that. And I think that more and more we need that type of way of being, because my overall experience in the universities is that you have these absolute understandings coming at you. And as just these, the professor of X understanding, the professor of Y understanding, and they never get to the singularity of your question and your quest and your, cultivation of your in itself, because they're only ever talking to you, responding to you through that understanding. But that doesn't mean we should become irrational. We have to keep our reason very much open to the indeterminacy of the moment.
Would you say that the givenness of Kant's category, it springs out of this adherence to the understanding, that concepts are different from, it's like, because the understanding, the way I'm hearing it right now, it's a kind of intuition, right? You don't sort of, it's a guiding concept, it's a ruling concept, perhaps.
Yeah, the relationship between the intuition and the understanding, definitely we should try to think this. It's kind of like there is something in the intuition which wants a unity without difference. And if I could put it like that. And now the danger is if your intuition hooks on the understanding, or your understanding hooks on the intuition in such a way as that there's no space for real differentiation. Right? So I think this is why it's important that Hegel's saying it's not that in phenomenology of spirit, he's not developing a foundation of science, but rather a foundation for what spirit is. And if you do science without understanding the nature of spirit, you run the risk of almost like, it's like shooting yourself in the foot, so to speak, but you're walking around with an advanced conceptual system without a good self-understanding. And that can be dangerous. And I do think that structures a lot of the problems within contemporary universities, but also in contemporary universities, this has to be thought also in the context of political economy. There's a lot of weight and incentive behind reification of a professor's understanding, because that's how I get paid, right? Like I am X type of, and it messes us up, so this is why we have to stay really with the tensions and difficulties of spiritual determination, because it does involve difficult life decisions where you might have to go into some sort of antagonism with power structures. That's been my whole life, really. Like my whole adult development is, I don't really, the consequence of thinking this way is that you don't really fit anywhere. You're just this becoming, you don't, as soon as someone tries to fit you somewhere, immediately you're going to feel too reified, and either you work with those contradictions or you become stuck, kind of. That's my experience. But certainly it makes you like a difficult piece to fit. You're a part of no part in some sense. But then, sorry, go ahead.
No. I was just about to say this reification of the teaching of philosophy, totally explains why Hegel is not taught, basically, in like
right.
Generally speaking.
That's the thing, is that especially, I don't want to psychologize certain people, but there is a certain type of intellect that is going, no matter what, I think going into Hegel and reading Hegel is going to be a dizzying experience because of the nature of his writing itself. It's just that there are some people who have a psychological temperament which are not willing to become dizzied, so to speak, or not willing to be disoriented, right? So they'd rather say just obscurantist nonsense than bother with the dizzying sensation. Dawson? Oh, you're not. You gotta unmute yourself first.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so the aspect you brought up regarding the art, religion, science, conceptual determinations, it kind of reminded me of Badiou has this idea about truth procedures and like truth events and like paying fidelity to the truth event of the development of a concept. And I think that's interesting to think from like a historical materialist standpoint of like this kind of the movement of the real in the generation of the concept, and the science of logic to be like how you're saying like the task of philosopher is to think of those things and their conceptual determination. So that aspect of like this reflective motion of these different things. And so I was curious about you know, throughout the course, like structurally speaking, like, you know, touching upon the concepts and directly just focusing on the text of the logic itself, and then maybe what that relationship will be with how you're connecting those different, you know, conceptual categories like art, religion, science, and, you know, maybe how you're thinking about weaving those throughout the course.
Right. Well, yeah, this is definitely a good connection with Badiou's, I think, are they called? Yeah, you said truth procedures.
Yeah, the truth procedure.
Yeah. If you remind me, what he has 4 categories, right? With the 4th one being love.
Yeah. It's politics,
Yeah,
art, love, and science are his 4
yeah,
determinations. Kind of interesting because it's a little bit Kantian the way he just like presumes or presupposes those 4 categories, and that's
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So he leaves out religion and he includes politics, and so like that's already sort of like why I was pointing at the end of the presentation, where we have to think, okay, like, so Hegel in some sense presupposing the categories art, religion, and science. Where do we get those categories? How are they derived? And already with the example of Badiou, you say, well, he's transitioned the category of religion into the category of politics, so we have a historical derivation there. You know, so we have to think through this deeper, I think. And it's also interesting that Badiou takes the 3 and moves them into, I know it's the way I think it's 3 plus 1, because love is sort of something which is included into all the 3 categories. But no, for sure, one of my goals in the science of logic course, which feels like a daunting task, but it's something I'm going to try and do, is to pull out this material and try to situate it in relationship to things relevant for our time. So for example, the way I tried to do this presentation today, I opened up with a meditation on like particle physics and atomic manufacturing, which Hegel had no idea about either of those things, you know, but nonetheless, I think the way he's thinking is relevant for thinking about, like, for example, the inner contradiction in the life of a physicist between identification with a set of concepts on a certain ontology of particles, and the consequence of having at their disposal technologies and procedures which manipulate the foundations of reality itself. You know, playing with atoms, building things from atoms and so forth. What is the consequence of this type of activity? So, you know, I think Hegel prepares us imminently for this type of, you know, thinking these types of things, which is, you know, where philosophy and science, in my mind, should be meeting and discussing. Max?
I've been listening to Hulgate's lectures, and he talks about Hegel's presuppositionalist method. And I was looking in the introduction there, and he says this: the spiritual movement, this is in the chat, which in its simplicity gives its determinateness, and in this determinate gives itself its self-equality. This movement, which is thus the immanent development of the concept, is the absolute method of the concept, the absolute method of cognition, and at the same time, the immanent soul of the content. On this self-constructing path alone, I say, is philosophy capable of being objective demonstrative science. So what does Hegel mean by this quote, and how would it relate to this idea of presuppositionalist methodology?
Yeah, so it's a really advanced question. It's actually that quote of Hegel's is like one that I caught myself like smirking when I'm reading it, because it's like just Hegel, he has to be the absolute madman, you know, like he's so certain that he's got the absolute method, you know, like he's like it's like but like it's interesting, right? Like, because he's almost saying like like it's almost like he's saying like my method is the the movement of the in itself. Like it's not even like I'm it's not even like my method so much as I am thinking the absolute concept is moving through me, and this is the way it moves, you know. But the reason why Houlgate would say this is a presuppositionless method is because he's getting rid of, if so, and this is also going too deep already, but the main categories in the science of logic are being, essence, and concept. And already in the chapter on being, he in some sense annihilates being, like all the in sort of the way in which it is logically determined in some sense, and just goes and moves into essence as such. But what it means is he's not presupposing any ontology.
Right.
He's not. And so like there's like I have so many moments going through the science of logic where I'm thinking, is the whole of 20th century philosophy like a clown world? Because honestly, like there's so many things in like, and especially like, you know, I don't want to like jump too far ahead of myself, but when I think about some of the fundamental concepts of Heidegger or Deleuze, like they're staring at me right in the face in the science of logic. Like Hegel goes on and on about how negation of the negation is a pure affirmation, and you know, like and then like, and how being and nothing become pure becoming. And then like Deleuze is like, no, we're going to think as if Hegel never existed, and my philosophy is a philosophy of becoming and affirmation. It's like, what is this? What's going on here? So it's a really, I haven't got that far in my own.
So it's sort of like a suspension. It's an epoche.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing, is like that an absolute knowing, how I understand it, in like whatever the concepts Hegel's using for thinking about like infinity and self-relating, you know, being for self and stuff like this, is like it is a type of indeterminate, right? It doesn't operate with presuppositions, like and you know, in some sense, you need a process. And he says in the preface, one of the prefaces, that this does take time in actual maturity of the being.
Yes.
Like you do need to operate with presuppositions, like in your becoming, like as you're becoming a man, a woman, as you're becoming an adult. It's not that you can just avoid going through that process, but once you've sort of returned to the foundations of your whatever being for self, there's many ways Hegel talks about it. There's a way in which, yeah, you can more easily let those presuppositions go.
Right.
Jason?
Yeah, we discussed this ad nauseum, right, Max, on our little group. I guess related to that is, and related to my previous question about reason and understanding, do you think it's a bit ironic that the movement that calls itself the rationalist movement recently, they have this this big scandal with cryptocurrency, but the to cut a long story short, their foundations are wrong. You know, they're sort of effective altruism things, they're completely bunk, it turns out. But what you said earlier is very, I think, very, and Hegel bring this up in the introduction to phenomenology and the preface as well, that what you don't just look into the world, you actually also influence the world. Like having technology doesn't mean that the world is passive to you, you also actively change it. And with the rationalist community, they use statistics, right? They think that by taking into statistics, you can influence the world for the better. But actually, this very movement already changes the world. What do you think Hegel would say to the so-called rationalists? Should they be the understander community or something?
Right. Yeah.
So
Well, that's the,
yeah.
that's the thing, right? Is that there are very few thinkers who ask themselves these metacognitive questions of what, like, so for, I'm a rationalist, but what is rationality?
Mhm.
Right? Or, you know, I understand something, but what is the understanding? Right? Like, you don't understand how your cognitive operations work, and as a consequence, you run into self-relating paradoxes, you run into self-contradictions constantly. So that's one of the things that brought me to Hegel personally. And you know, like, for example, I think it's here important to pay attention to the way Hegel opens up chapter 1, I think it is, of the Science of Logic, where he says something like, let me just get the actual quote so I don't misquote Hegel here. But it's, just take me 1 minute. Yeah, with what must the beginning of science be made? Where he talks about how sciences are oftentimes, or as a rule, sciences that become sciences of external reflection. And so they don't understand the way in which their own positing of phenomena gets them caught up in antinomies. And so, you know, when he's talking about what you know, with what must the beginning of science be made, he makes the argument that it has to start with the very motion of your own cognitive processes. So these types of things need to be taken up more. And again, when you take up your own sort of cognitive processes into sort of conceptual determinations that you're moving within the world, it requires a certain movement with yourself, which is, again, can be dizzying. And so, yeah, it is the situation where, for example, if you take like Richard Dawkins' Foundation for Reason and Science, you could say these are purely based on external reflection, right? Like the way Dawkins understands evolutionary biology, you know, even he smuggles in, for example, his political presuppositions of a liberal democracy.
Especially
right?
to women and Muslims, yeah. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So all of these presuppositions are snuck in as rational. Like, so, but that's just our contemporary ideology. It, you know, being a liberal Democrat is the easiest thing to be in our current environment, because that is the hegemonic norm, is a liberal Democrat. So you're not, and in terms of like evolutionary biology, it's like you have an external reflection of the history of 4.5 billion years, but that doesn't help us with questions of, like, say, the imminence of that knowledge for world history.
Yeah.
That's very much open, and there's all sorts of funny jokes about that. Like the funniest joke I think about it is that religious communities out-reproduce non-religious communities, right? So like they're more evolutionarily fit, right? Like, so, and like, and so that's an example of a historical paradox, which, you know, let's think about that. Like, in, you know, and that's one of the another big things that people miss in that community is, if religion was so dominant throughout human history, what might be the evolutionary fitness of religion as such? Right? Like, why it wouldn't be that strong if it didn't serve something for evolutionary purposes in that worldview. Max?
Just to go back onto the question about what the science of logic is about, again, in the introduction, Hegel says, it's here in the chat, accordingly, logic is to be understood as the system of pure reason, as the realm of pure thought. This realm is truth unveiled, truth as it is in and for itself. It can therefore be said that this content is the exposition of God, as he is in his eternal essence before the creation of nature and of infinite spirit.
Yeah, there are some lines Hegel says where he's just like the absolute madman, right? Like, and there's no question in this text, at least in my mind, that Hegel is sort of situating himself as unfolding his conceptual determinations in something like the mind of God. And not only saying that, but saying that that is open to historical subjectivity. Like that state of mind is open to subjectivity. Now, I don't have all the final answers for all the mysteries of the science of logic, but there is a way in which Hegel is mediating the relationship between the finite and the infinite.
Right.
He's mediating that very conceptual determination. And so, like, you know, as a consequence of that mediation, he does find himself in the position of, it's almost like, so how I've gotten to it in my understanding is the dogmatic fundamentalist religious belief puts the infinite separate and opposed from the finite.
Right.
But Hegel's thinking about that as being historically mediated by the concept in historical reality. That's the mediation of the infinite and the finite. And that in that infinite, he goes through a whole bunch of dialectical tensions with this relationship. And ultimately, if you really pay attention to his thought when he's mediating this, to me, the geometry I get in my head is kind of like the geometry of a Mobius loop, where it kind of like turns in on itself. And it's almost like what the infinite beyond is, what he calls the bad infinity, what the infinite beyond is actually becomes what you are. It's kind of like you flip over. So religious believers in that sense, fundamentalist dogmatic religious believers, are really separated from themselves. They're really not in a being for self. And Hegel flips that. But he's also saying that the modernist secularist person doesn't even think about the metaphysical mediation of infinity and finitude. So that's an even bigger problem in some sense, right? So like, in some sense, we're having a regression to dogmatic religious belief because the secular evolutionary world isn't doing a good enough job of mediating fundamental metaphysical tensions like the finite and the infinite. And the science of logic gives us the tools to engage in such mediation. Like, and this is something that's like hitting me in the face while I'm reading, is that when Hegel says logic is metaphysics and metaphysics is logic, he's really being serious. Like when he thinks about the concept of infinity, he's thinking about it in its concept. He's thinking about it as a concept.
What do you mean by that? What do you mean by he's thinking about it as a concept?
Like he's not, so when we think of infinity, for example, you might have a spontaneous intuition of, I don't know, some infinite world, some world of light, or some world of an eternal being or an eternal paradise. But he's thinking about the concept of infinity. He's thinking about the way in which that concept emerges in the historical process. From finite beings, as our very aspiration, as our very, he says even if you mention the concept of infinity to someone, it lifts their spirit, it raises their thought. They need to think that, right? So he's talking about an immanent tension internal to the finite. So we'll get more into that. That's already going too far. And Dimitri, last question.
Yes, so isn't this the most disembodied, unembodied way of thinking? The purity of concepts, the purity of my own thinking, you know, needing to write an encyclopedia and a huge fucking tome of the science of logic. Like, get outside and walk through the forest and talk with some people, man. Like, you're, like Nietzsche says, you don't have clear thoughts when you sit inside. Get out of the encyclopedia. Is this a fair critique of Hegel or not?
I think that that's certainly one way to read Hegel, and that's one way to also deconstruct or negate Hegel. And I think the dominant response and reception of Hegel in the philosophical tradition that emerges after Hegel is that interpretation, what you just say, right? Like you think about Kierkegaard and the way Kierkegaard approached Hegel is a similar way. There's this way in which existentialism emerges after Hegel in precisely this feeling. This idea that Hegel is a conceptual monster which eats everything and so forth. But at least in my reading of Hegel, it's actually quite the opposite, that in some sense he does away with this in regards to the relationship between being and essence already, that he gets rid of these conceptual ontologies in that usually structure our understanding of being, almost so that you can really engage essence. And there's actually one thing that I want to focus on in the class itself, where it seems to me that Hegel perfectly opens up psychoanalysis by saying that when the scientists and the pragmatists think that they can do away with logic, actually what they forgot is that logic is necessary for the mediation of instinct. So to me, that's crucial, is that what the type of thinking Hegel's opening up is not a disembodied logic. It's thinking the essence of the body as such. Like, that's where we move from being to essence. You know, like, you're actually capable of working with logic and libido, I would say. But this is, you know, but anyway, this is what you're saying here is something which has often been said about Hegel. All right, so that was the first pre-course session. We haven't even gotten into obviously we've gotten into a little bit of the science of logic through questions, but this is just to sort of set us up for having a deeper shared understanding as it relates to moving through the course. So thanks for everyone for showing up, and I'm going to exit out of the recording, and I hope to see all of you or most of you at future sessions.